I would say that it's too early to say there's trust because people haven't even come to the table for the overall discussion. You know, I was thinking about years ago when I first moved to Milwaukee, and we probably had 5 times the amount of block grant funding coming from the feds into the city. We had a very, very vibrant housing development system of nonprofits, as well as community development block. I mean, we even had very vibrant block clubs out there. And that's, you know, there's still real strengths out there, but it's not like it was with all the players that were at the table as connected as it was. So I think that the ability to have trust means we have to come together, we have to pick some common things that we're going to start to work on that we can move forward successfully. Can it be done? I would just point to Milwaukee 7. If we can get 7 counties that had very disparate views around economic development to the table to share resources and a common vision to have the kind of wins that have been coming even with the foreign companies now coming to into this region, we can certainly do this at the community level. But first we got to get around the table. We got to figure out what the roles are and have some clear expectations. It's got to be more than just about the money if we're going to make it work. Money's a big part of it, but it's got to be a lot more than that in partnership. And once we can start moving forward on that, trust is earned, it's not given. And in this situation, we've got to sit down and start to build the trust.
Regularly, how often are you talking about sitting down and saying, this is the shared vision, this is what we're doing right now, this is how effective it's been? How often do
Well, I would say certainly more than once every 10 years. I think whenever you start these things out structurally, you know, probably once a quarter. I mean, and leadership emerges in different sectors, and you need to grab that leadership and run with it, and that's what we got to start to do.
Rob, how do we expand the collaboration? How do we build the trust?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, the politics in this town, unfortunately, are growing worse. I think we're seeing greater and greater polarization. To me, what would be nice to see is sort of a greater agenda, again, not based on whether you define yourself as a liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican, but really, aren't there things we can agree upon that are needed, those necessary ingredients to allow the city of Milwaukee to succeed? You know, when I look at it, again, I mentioned consensus earlier, harkening back to the transit issue. I mean, few are aware of the hard work that Julia Taylor and the Greater Milwaukee Committee and the Metropolitan Milwaukee Association of Commerce put into the Regional Transit Authority issue. I mean, mass transit is an issue where people from the extremes of the political spectrum here in Milwaukee seemed to agree. Nobody focuses on that agreement. We focus on the disagreement because we're fighting over rail versus buses. Well, can we come together and decide what a transit system that we'd all want to serve our needs here in Milwaukee would look like and use that as a means of gaining consensus? So I think there are issues where there is, again, greater consensus than we might otherwise think, and those are the ones where we need to get the poles of this community together.
Mayor, this is a first step. What would you do next? I mean, what would make sense for us?
Well, my personal feeling is I'd always rather be stabbed in the chest than stabbed in the back. And what I try to do in my dealings is I'd rather stab someone in the chest than stab them in the back. I think that's actually one of the first steps towards communication, that you can have an honest dialogue. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be pretty all the time. And the question is, does a no destroy communication? And for some people it does. But at a time when we as a local government cannot print money, and we are seeing severe cutbacks from the state and from the federal level, and the cutbacks are being forced to go onto our employees, what I see literally is police officers pitted against librarians. I see firefighters pitted against public health nurses and sanitation workers. And I can tell you that leads to more distrust. But frankly, I think that's part of the strategy, that there are some people who feel they can gain an advantage if they can divide and conquer. And I don't think there's a person in this room who should be fooled by the notion that if we divide ourselves, that somehow we're going to be better off. Because in the short run, we might be better off. But if we're all pitted against each other, we're in a world of hurt. And that's my cautionary word, that these are difficult times. This is when we should be coming together this isn't when we should be dividing ourselves. But I say that knowing that there are times when I or the city is the one saying no, that the money has been cut, the money's just not there. So I think we are all being tested and are going to be tested more because of that.
Sharon Adams, what's the next step? How do we increase the collaboration? How do we build the trust, in your opinion?
Well, listen, and I think that in listening to this conversation, I was listening to what perhaps I didn't hear. And I am so place-based. I live in a 110-block area. And I know that 30% or more of our commercial corridors are blighted and vacant. So here to me is we listen for opportunity. I live in an old neighborhood that used to have light manufacturing. To me, that's an opportunity. And I talk to my neighbors and my partners with their excitement of seeing small business ownership. And I say, aha, there's an opportunity. So I think in agreement with building consensus, there really is lifting this voice of economic prosperity that looks at places, that looks at it as opportunities, and drives us towards solutions. I think those are the next steps.
Gary Grunow?
Yes, that enables me to maybe follow up on my earlier comments of the history of Milwaukee, but we're at a point right now that probably the perception of the public body towards the developers is worse than the reality, and the perception of the developers towards the city is worse than the reality. And I think it's needed that we get together and sit down and take the skeletons out of the closet and talk about what concerns both the city and the developing community. It's not right for developers to go around one branch of government and talk to another branch of government. And it's not, it just isn't right. And things like that start to happen, they start to build distrust. As long as I remember, as I can remember, and going way back, we have actually three branches of government too. We have the administrator, the executive, the common council, and the controller. And I think that somehow if those three can be brought together with the developer community as a four-person or four-bodied, we'd be able to move this city forward a lot better. We get somebody in from Chicago. Those of you that are in the real estate business, which I'm doing full-time now, I'm out of the construction business, and they want to come to Milwaukee. And they go out and they look at three places in Milwaukee where they can locate. Each of those three people are talking to that company, plus the city's talking to them, plus M7's talking to them, and we don't know what the other guy's saying. And we must look like a bunch of you-know-whats somehow, but nobody really thinks if we get everybody together that we're all going to sit there and we're going to take advantage of one another, which is baloney. If I'm chasing somebody and they go into Mike Mervis's building, God bless them if they're moving into the city. We got to bring jobs into the city. We just can't keep reshuffling the deck chairs in the city. And if we can get together as developers, as the city, and work collaboratively, and M7, they bring a lot of horsepower too, we can figure out how to attract these companies. And believe me, if we can move 150 jobs to Milwaukee, and I don't get them at Schlitz, God bless Milwaukee. We got them at least in Milwaukee, and they're going to fill up a building I don't have to worry about anymore or compete against. So that's good.
Nelson Solon.
Come together and do it.
Well, I think trust is earned with inclusion and transparency. But I will do a disservice if I don't address the comments made by Julia and Mr. Grunow here. The other side of the question are the entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurs don't need to be convinced to go to their neighborhood. They're willing to open their business there. They don't need to be convinced to hire minorities, women, or whoever lives in the neighborhood. They're willing to do it. People will not need a boss if they're hired in their neighborhood, if there is employment in their neighborhood. So we need to have both initiatives congruent. We cannot forget the entrepreneurs. We cannot forget the value entrepreneurship adds, how people get self-empowered by becoming an entrepreneur and a business owner, and how that drives less properties blighted. Right, Sharon?
As we are speaking, there are hundreds of people that are visiting our city, part of the National Black Public Relations Society Conference, which includes the media. So my question or comment is, what is the role of media in order to turn around the city especially in the reporting of neighborhoods, which I think that a lot of negative gets reported as far as the negative versus the positive, but I think they need to do a better job just reporting on the city. So I'd like to get viewpoints from the panelists about the media's role in being part of the revitalization of the city.
Well,
Should I leave the room?
I mentioned the Villard Square Library and its grand opening. Again, 8 years ago, there were news clips all over the place, newspaper stories, radio broadcasts about the demonstrations that were occurring because of the city had decided to close down that library. And of course, we did this Lazarus Act where we rose it from the dead. And not only did it stay open, we built a beautiful, beautiful new library with grandparent housing on the 3 floors above. And of course, you all saw it on the, oh wait, you didn't see it on the news. Unless you watched Channel 58. Because we had 2 different ceremonies opening on Saturday. There were hundreds of people there in a neighborhood that's economically distressed. A remarkable turnaround.
But can I suggest, Mayor Northwood, Mayor Northwood made sure that when something like that was happening, the press was here. And could I suggest to you that you do that as well? Because unless the people who have the power, the white guys in suits, and that's some of the issues here in Milwaukee, and I think Gary spoke to it very well, that if the leadership of the city doesn't say to the media, I need to have you here to show what's going on that's happening well. That's the first thing. The second thing is, there was a video done that was being sent to companies who might be considering moving to Milwaukee, and there were no minorities in that video. That should not have gone out of this city without you or other people in this room, the powers that be, looking at that video to make sure that it properly represented what was going on in Milwaukee. The third thing is, I don't know if you're familiar with what the city of St. Louis did, but the city of St. Louis was having the same kind of issues we were having, and they turned it around. They did 3 things. The most important thing they did was they had a discussion about race and what that meant in a city that is highly segregated, which Milwaukee is. The second thing they did is they had sort of a clearinghouse where all the ideas that were being put forth in the city of St. Louis went through this group. The third thing they did is that everybody was involved in the group had to agree to agree. And I know almost everybody in this room, and I am so frustrated that we can't get anything done because of what happens behind the scenes. So my thought process is everybody has to agree to agree. And until we agree to agree and stop having these turf wars and not covering the things in the city that are positive, we're going to be back here in 10 years. I hosted, I was the moderator for something like this 10 years ago. And I'm frustrated that I'm back here after 10 years having the same discussion. So I just feel like it's very important for all the people in this room to take ownership, to stop having these turf wars, and to look at how we can all come together as a group and figure out one plan for the city of Milwaukee that encompasses everybody and does not say we're going to exclude any groups. And I'm sorry for jumping up like that, but you know, it's just like.
Thanks for the comment, Margaret. Anybody want to weigh in on that?
Let me just say, on the media, the first point issue, I can guarantee you that we begged, cajoled, yelled at the media to cover that. So we don't control that, but there's no, I'm letting this community know what an incredible that was to a primarily African-American neighborhood by the media in this community. In terms of the second thing, I mean, I never saw the video you're referring to, and I can guarantee you, had I seen it, I would not have allowed that to happen in the city with the makeup we have today. And third and finally, I don't think we should be as defensive as we are here. We have real challenges. Our poverty challenges and our educational challenges are huge. Our job challenges are huge. But if you talk about St. Louis, or you talk about Cleveland, or you talk about Pittsburgh, or you talk about Detroit, or you talk about Chicago, quite honestly, if you look at, for example, population loss, we have more than held our own as a community. And just Tuesday, I was down in Chicago, and this was on urban agriculture, and we were the rock star. Milwaukee was the rock star, to the point where the guy from the White House came up to me and he said, you got to take more credit for this, because all the communities are looking at Milwaukee. And what I said, and this gets to Gary Grunau's point about philosophy towards some of these initiatives, I said our role was to get out of the way. That we had some really good people in this community that were obviously cutting edge on urban agriculture, and our job was to make sure that they could do it. And I was actually surprised when I heard mayors from other cities saying that they hadn't done this stuff. So it wasn't a headline-grabbing action. It was more, let's organically let this occur. And I really think that that can be part of the strength. If you look at the South Side, for example, and this is maybe urban myth, but years ago, the urban myth I heard was that DCD was putting together a plan on how to develop a Hispanic business area, and all of a sudden it occurred in another area because it occurred organically. And so it goes back to my initial point, just do it, just do it. And my philosophy is we want to work with you collectively. That doesn't mean we're all going to say yes. That doesn't mean there's probably not a person in this room who couldn't have a horror story about working with city government. But let's see if we can work together.
Anybody else? Yes, Ron.
Just 2 quick points, Mike. First of all, I think as serious as the problem is of our local news media not being interested in covering good news, I think an even bigger problem is how they're covering the bad news, and the leading every night on the local newscast with heinous crime stories, and the amount of coverage devoted to rampaging African-American youth at State Fair Park. I think that there really needs to be some scrutiny as to just how every single night we're reporting what's going on and how we're defining news. In terms of a possible suggestion, I think that there are media watch groups nationally that try to serve as a watchdog, much in the same way that I'm sure the mayor probably cringes at PolitiFact. What the Journal-Sentinel has done with PolitiFact toward elected officials, it would be good to have some type of an independent group doing the same type of thing in terms of the local news media and pointing out where local news media coverage is perhaps biased or just plain factually incorrect. And perhaps that's a role that the university could play in terms of establishing some type of a watchdog element over the news media.
Mm-hmm. I would add just to Margaret's comment as someone who worked in the media on a day-to-day basis for 30 years or so. I still always encourage people, I have about 2 or 3 people ask for a meeting with the news director and come in and tell them how you feel. It's very hard. People get in their offices, they get in their little rooms, and they're away from the community. And they're consumed with overnight ratings and all of this other nonsense. But when you sit down across from someone and you tell them, this is how we feel. This was a big event in our community, and you didn't think it was worthy of coverage. I do think you'll get some results. I actually believe that. I mean, the station where I do our show right now, Channel 12, it's run by women, largely. An African-American woman is the news director. The general manager is a woman. I think they're sensitive to some of those subjects, but I would encourage people in this room, if you're just not happy, ask for a meeting. 2 or 3 people come in and just lay out, give a couple of examples of what you've seen and why. Because I can tell you this, we used to have long conversations in the newsroom, and then I'll be quiet, but we used to have long conversations in the newsroom about, and this would drive me crazy, about the potential long-term damage that can be done to a community by a news story or a repetitive news story. Or merely by asking someone, just someone on the street in a neighborhood, their opinion about something, and that opinion will be, I'm moving, it's not safe here. That becomes the spokesman for the entire neighborhood. That does long-term damage to a community. So my way of addressing that is, you need to be there across the table saying, this is important to us, this is also our community, we would really appreciate it if you would recognize the other stuff that's going on, the stuff that's important to us. So that would be my encouragement to you. I'm sorry to take up time. Yes, Tyrone.
We'd like to, today one of the missing components, I think, is education. 1/4 of our population in Milwaukee is 0 to 18. Schools are in every community, in every neighborhood. Somehow, where do they fit into this equation? Because whether it's a facility that's out of control or a great school, or whether it's the issues of young people, that's one of the critical issues for me in community development. Where do we go? Because they inherit this community or lead it. At some point, they're not represented is the way I would like to. But where does education sit? Because without that, that's usually one of the leading headlines in this community every day is the bad things about education. And what does that do to people also?
Anybody want to take a shot at that? Yeah, Julia, and then we'll go down here. Sure.
Yeah, I think, Tyrone, that's a great point, because that's the way you actually get the talent in the communities is through the educational system. And I think what's going on with Milwaukee Succeeds is very important, and I think it's got to be a partnership companion piece to whatever happens in community development. I think those schools are important anchors in those neighborhoods too, and are important part of community development. And I was just going to say for Margaret too, if I had seen that video going out, I mean, one, it's insulting to our community, and two, it's sure to fail. I mean, how are you going to attract?
That video at an event 4 or 5 years ago, and it was a video that was intended to promote Milwaukee. I can't remember who did it, I'm having a senior moment, but, and it was intended to promote the city of Milwaukee, and it was almost totally white. So I don't know who did it, but, it's things like that that I'm trying to address in my comments relative to the way the people who are in power in Milwaukee think or don't think about the groups that are disenfranchised here. So that was why I'm saying, as far as the media is concerned and how we portray it, that's where you need a clearinghouse that says, whatever shapes the image of Milwaukee, there needs to be a thoughtful group of people looking at that to make sure that the image is properly portrayed, and that we all have the same, cause. But a lot of money got spent on that, and it did go out before people complained about it.
And I'd like to think we're past that point, but evidently we're not, so thank you.
I'd like to comment just on 2 areas that this may be tied to. One is the power that we have to create some of our own image. And we need to not give that away. I agree with you that we need to be watchful, that we need to look at it. But in the Lindsay Heights neighborhoods, there is a video-based neighborhood news service. And it contains our information. It is a demonstration. It's being fostered in partnership with Marquette, but it is a way for us to craft our message, and crafting our message intentionally changes our culture. So I just think that it can't always be the other, it is us, and that we have to grow our power, and that also speaks when our mayor speaks about organic, and I am one that in my community now we're planting 62 fruit trees, including peaches this day. But what does that really mean to be organic? Organic is hard work. Organic means you're not using pesticides. You're not taking the easy route. And so there are policies that are set in place that help us be organic. And the city has done this. And I would call upon you to keep doing it. If we're going to have entrepreneurs, if we're going to change our commercial corridors, there has to be the policy and the environment that makes that happen for us.
I had 2 nonprofits around the corner of 16th and Oklahoma on the south side. And when I come to a conference like this that talks about economic development and community development and many of these things, more often than not, what I walk away with is a vision of the city being defined as primarily near south side or immediately north side. And there are many other neighborhoods, many other communities within the boundaries of the city. So my request as one of those living beyond those boundaries is, how do we truly make this a citywide discussion and not just simply focused on what I believe has been the traditional boundaries of these type of discussions? My fear is that sometimes there's a perception that's based on just looking at a facade or a veneer that says, oh, your neighborhoods are not as, therefore things must be okay, therefore we can wait, we can prolong, or, sad to say, Mayor, we'll give you a little bit of coinage to, because you're not as whatever. And I think that we need to look below that veneer and realize that in many instances, we're really hanging on by our fingernails. And it would be best if we are included more in a systematic plan with a real thoughtfulness to it than simply an afterthought. Or as the money is allocated and there's a few change or coins, oh yes, we'll give it out to these other neighborhoods because we need to focus over here. So it's more of a plea that we need to have a true citywide plan rather than one just focusing again on just pockets.
Before you respond, who would you like to lead that effort? Because you're talking about somebody has to really lead on that front. Is it List? Who would you like to see lead that system-wide effort?
Well, I think List most definitely should play a role into it, but also the elected officials, the aldermen, the county, but more so the city elected officials need to look at that.
Okay, great question. Anybody want to take a
Let me just go back. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting with my kids in the kitchen, and we always sort of tease, okay, Dad, which of us do you like the most? Which of us do you love the most? And I said to him, well, okay, I'll take each of you one by one into the other room, and I'll tell you who I love the most. And the same concept applies here. Which neighborhood do I love the most? Let's meet outside individually, and I'll let you know. Tell me what neighborhood you're from, and I'll let you know which neighborhood I love the most. But that's my challenge. That is my challenge. But you're right that there are resources that are devoted. A lot of it is done through federal law, the Community Development Block Grant. A lot of it is done through need because we have these issues in poverty neighborhoods. But that's not to say there aren't good things that are happening in other neighborhoods. If you look at the Garden District, probably most people in here don't know what the Garden District is. It is the South Side Aldermanic District that is represented by Terry Witkowski, who has done a phenomenal job in introducing gardens and block clubs throughout that neighborhood to give it a sense of belonging because it's a part of the city that does at times feel separate from the city. Or the Hartung neighborhood on the far west side near Mount Mary, where a neighborhood group got together and worked to have the quarry changed to a park. Now, we've got some challenges there, but that came organically. And so, again, I'm going to keep hitting this same note. The organic work that can be done, the work that Sharon has done. 5 years ago, not many people had heard of Sharon, but she, working with her neighbors, has brought a lot of attention to that. So don't ever underestimate what a person or persons can do working together and even moving the city bureaucracy, because it happens. And again, it may not get a lot of media coverage, it may not get a lot of fanfare, but it's in my best political interest, quite selfishly, to make sure that every part of the city feels loved. I mean, it doesn't do me any good if I'm purposefully excluding a part of the city. And I think that all of us in government feel the same way, all right? What can we do to make sure that everybody feels that they're part of this? I don't want people to feel that they're not part of it. I don't want people to feel disengaged or alienated, because that's where that infighting then can really become toxic to a community.